Hello, party people. Welcome back to the Validity Podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Rodriguez, and I think this is episode 12. And I think a lot of the past episodes have been a lot about like feeding strategies, body recomp, fat loss. Today, we're going to take a little bit of like a pivot and we're going to talk about deloads and injury prevention as two completely separate topics, actually. But in another one of our classes in strength and conditioning, we did cover the only paper on deloads that has come out. It did come out in 2024. So it is a very, very recent, very up and coming on the forefront of the field, I guess, or the research on deloads. So we're going to be going through that study as well as just doing a quick overview on the research on injury prevention. Because one of the things that we talked a lot about in strength and conditioning is the role of a strength and conditioning coach in athletic populations in the context of athletes whose sport is not the training. So it's very different when we're thinking about powerlifters or we're thinking about bodybuilders because their sport is their time in the weight room. But when you're thinking about like team athletes, like football players, soccer players, tennis players, they have a strength and conditioning coach and they spend time in the weight room to improve certain things in the weight room that need to translate to improvements in sport-specific skills. So there's a lot of research as to what do you do in the weight room? How does that translate to improvements in sport-specific skills? And there's also a debate as to whether the role of a strength and conditioning coach is all that important in the context of these team athletes. But one of the things that is not contended is the role of hypertrophy and of strength training in injury prevention. And so I think that that's one of the really, really important roles of a strength and conditioning coach in the context of these team athletes. So we'll get into that in the second half of the episode. But one thing that I do kind of want to say before we get into this episode is I know that my past few episodes have been a little bit shorter than the first few ones. And I don't know if you guys prefer the longer ones, if you guys like the shorter ones. I know everyone has a preference. So if somebody can email me at thevaliditypodcast@gmail.com or DM my podcast Instagram and just let me know, like, I actually prefer the longer episodes or I actually prefer the shorter episodes. It'll give me a little bit of an insight as to how we're feeling about these more or less shorter episodes. So honestly, it depends on the topic we're covering and what the lecture was and the amount of research that there is. But I want to make sure that you guys feel like you're getting a comprehensive amount of knowledge. So anyways, before we get into the science, you already know, quick updates. When it comes to what we're doing in Dr. Campbell's Performance and Physique Enhancement Lab with the world's first reverse dieting study, recruitment is open and the study is officially underway today. The first batch of subjects are submitting their check-in data from the previous week. And obviously everyone's still in their maintenance phase because there's a maintenance, a dieting, and a post-dieting phase. But I will say the response has been so overwhelming that we might actually have to close recruitment just so we can finish processing everybody who's shown interest up until this point. I didn't think to check my hidden DM requests, and I've been going through them every single day, and I probably still have about 150 to 200 unanswered DMs that I'm desperately trying to get to. Every single day I'm like chipping away. And apart from that, we have the recruitment email that we've received probably well over 300 something emails expressing interest to that recruitment email. And we've processed well over 150 to 200 people. And we've fully onboarded almost 50 complete subjects that have filled out all their form, all the back and forth, assigned a coach, informed consent. Like there's a lot of logistical back-end stuff that has to happen back and forth before a subject can go from expressing interest to being assigned a coach and being fully like onboarded into the study. And we already have almost 50 people who've completed that process. And that's while we still have a lot more to continue processing and getting forms from. So bear with us because we probably do have to take a little bit of a break from like opening up recruitment while we finish processing all these people, and then we'll be able to open it back up. But that being said, continue expressing your interest because if you email, you will get a response. It might take a day or two, but you will get a response because we've been able to adequately delegate tasks. So every step of the onboarding process, somebody is delegated with that task so that we can kind of have a system that's smoothly up and running. So that's kind of what's going on that front. It is Friday, no refeed today, but I do have a research meeting. So after I finish filming this, I will be going to the research meeting and we'll be going through the first round of people's check-in data, just making sure every coach is comfortable understanding what to look for, making sure that all subjects have submitted their check-in data as needed, working out any kinks, answering any questions, and preparing for continuing to take on a greater subject load for every coach/research member. So that's that. That's what we'll be doing today, later in the research meeting. When it comes to little personal updates, I did post that we finally solidified a show date for me, and it is quite soon-ish, sooner than I would personally like in a perfect world. I would have even more time to continue bringing in conditioning, but the show that I'm doing for the first show of my season really is not like, oh my God, this is the show, we're going to step on stage and blow everything out of the water. It really is going to be like one of those shows where it's like, okay, I need to re-qualify for nationals, and nationals is my main goal. So this is the only show that really makes sense from now until the national show that I want to do, that is like nearby, has a good judging panel. And I think I'm like conditioned enough. I will be conditioned enough by the time I step on that stage to at least get a qualification. So we're really just doing this to like slide into a show, get the qualification so that I don't need to stress about it. And then I can just focus on nationals and continue grinding, continue bringing in that conditioning. So we're mostly doing to just hopefully get a little qualification so that we can get that out of sight, out of mind. Also get some feedback from the judging panel, because it is going to be a national level judging panel at the show. And also enjoy a really nice night with my friends, because my friends are going to be there, and I'm so excited to drink a spicy skinny pineapple margarita. Oh my God. I hope you guys know the countdown on my phone since I started prep. So I've had this for hundreds of days, like 100 something days. It is not show day. It is not, I don't know what you think my countdown would be. It is literally margarita. That is what I have been counting down in my countdown app for however many days I've been on prep. It's been 17 weeks now. So it's been a minute that I've been yearning for this margarita. So I'm very excited also to just like have a night with my friends who've been so supportive this entire prep, and with my boyfriend who's just been like putting all the fun couple stuff on the back burner because we have to just focus on prep. So it'll be very nice to have that nice little break, hopefully get an intuitive eating day the next day, and then right back to the grind so we can focus on nationals. But I'm excited. We'll see how it goes. If I don't get the qualification, we'll go back to the drawing board, and that's that. No crazy emotional investment when it comes to the outcome, because we just got to see how we're stacking up. You know, there's only one way to know sometimes. It's to put yourself out there. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the science. So for deloads, what we're going to cover is what is considered the world's first study published on deloads. It's called Gaining More from Doing Less, the Effects of a 1-Week Deload Period During Supervised Resistance Training on Muscular Adaptations. It's by Coleman et al. And again, it was published in 2024, so very, very recent study. And the overview of this study design is that they had two groups. Both of the groups were 9 weeks long. Both of them were resistance training during this entire period. We'll go through what that protocol looked like. But there was one group that did traditional resistance training, so basically straight all the way, 9 weeks straight of training. The other group had 9 weeks of training, but in the middle, they had 1 week off. So a 1 week, quote unquote, deload. And that means that's 4 weeks of training, 1 week off of training, followed by 4 weeks of training. And then everything was compared at the beginning of the 9 weeks and at the end of the 9 weeks. They had 50 male and female resistance trained volunteers between the ages of 18 and 40 years old. And again, they were randomized to either this deload group that had 4 weeks on training, a 1 week deload, followed by 4 more weeks of training, or to the traditional resistance training group. It's called the TRAD group. And the TRAD group just trained for 9 weeks straight. So what was their training protocol? They were resistance training 4 times a week, 2 upper body sessions and 2 lower body sessions. The upper body sessions were unsupervised, so they were given a program and they were told, do this on your own. And the lower body sessions were come into the lab. They were supervised by the research staff, and only lower body muscles were assessed in the ultrasound outcomes, which is why those were the ones that were supervised. When it comes to the actual training program, the upper body routine, which was unsupervised to be done on their own, was 5 exercises. It was shoulder press, lat pull down, chest press, bicep curl, tricep push down. So 1 exercise per muscle group, pretty standard. They did do 5 sets of every exercise, and it was 8 to 12 reps. So I would say that's pretty adequate for like a hypertrophic program. It was supposed to be their 8 to 12 rep max. So they were supposed to be going to failure within those 8 to 12 reps, and they were told to have 2-minute rests. Again, this was the unsupervised upper body routine that they were to do twice a week. The lower body routine, which they came into the lab to do, was 4 exercises. It was Smith machine squats, leg extensions, straight knee calf raises, and bent knee calf raises. And again, everything was 5 sets of 8 to 12 reps, reaching failure within that rep range with 2-minute rests. And I definitely don't think this is an inadequate training program, but if you are going to be measuring changes in lower body muscle group lean mass, and mostly the quads is what they look at, and you're only doing squat and leg extension because the other 2 exercises are 2 calf exercises. So your full leg day is squats, leg extensions, and then 2 calf exercises. To me, that seems a little bit insufficient, but it is 5 sets, and it is 5 sets of failure at 8 to 12 reps. So I would say that that's good enough. But again, they're only training this 2 times a week because it's 2 upper, 2 lower. Whatever. Let's move on. So I have a couple qualms about their lower body program, but again, I train lower body like a motherfucker, so maybe I'm biased because I be spamming my glutes like 700 gajillion times a week, but it is what it is, you know? We'll see what they found. And then you guys can determine if you think it was adequate or not. So what did they measure? They measured body composition using an in-body machine, and they used ultrasound to measure muscle thickness, which one of the things we talked about was that in this study, the technician immediately obtained their muscle thickness measurements, and normally you save the data without actually like reporting the initial measurement so that when you go and do the follow-up measurement, you're not biased as to what it was the first time around, so that you don't, try to move the ultrasound wand a little bit to try to get a bigger measurement. And I'm not saying that these researchers were like finessing the data by any means, but typically in science, you don't obtain the actual measurement right away. You just collect it, but you don't actually go out and take the data and extract it and see what the initial measurement is, so that you're not biased when you go do the follow-up measurement and you know what you would be expecting a greater number, I would say. So it does remove an element of blinding. I don't think it's catastrophic, but again, if we're going through and we're looking at this one study, it's the only study we have for deloads ever. So if we're going to be looking at it and basing everything that we can confidently say, at least according to literature, is going to be based on this one study, then we need to be looking at it really in depth. So these are the kind of things that we discussed when we discussed the study in our strength and conditioning class taught by Dr. Buckner. So again, let's recap before we get into the results, because this is pretty much the study. Okay, so 50 male, female resistance trained volunteers. You're either doing 9 weeks of straight training in the traditional group, or you're doing 9 weeks of training in the deload group, where you have 1 week off of training completely in the middle of your 9 weeks. So 4 weeks training, 1 week deload, 4 weeks training. Body composition, muscle thickness, and strength was measured at the beginning of the 9 weeks and at the end of the 9 weeks. So what did they find? There was no difference between the 2 groups. There was absolutely no difference. No difference in body composition, no difference in muscle thickness. And the only thing that was slightly different was that strength seemed to be higher in the traditional resistance training group, but not by a ton. So this study was marketed, shared, pushed by people on social media to say, like, you can take 1 week off and get the same amount of gains. So take the week off. Like, deloads are effective. Like, you can take a deload and see the same amount of gains. And it's like, okay, great. That's fantastic. I think this is a great, like, conceptual thing for people to walk away with, to be able to rest assured if you have to miss a session, if you have to take a week off for a vacation, you're clearly not killing your gains. Like, we have this objective data saying 1 week off is not going to kill your gains. But do I think that this is at its core actually studying the effects of a true deload? I'm dubious. Because when we talk about why we would need a deload, usually it's at the end of like a mesocycle. It's when you have an athlete reporting overall accumulating feelings of fatigue, of being run down, or you see performance decrements. And so it's like, okay, let's pull back before we start a next block, or let's pull back and deload to like resensitize you. There's a philosophy behind deloading, which is to resensitize yourself to the anabolic stimulus of training. So it's saying like, if you're training indefinitely and you never pull back, your body's going to stop responding as efficaciously to the stimulus of training. So sometimes anecdotally, people will say that they implement deloads to resensitize yourself to the anabolic stimulus of training. However, do we think 4 weeks is enough to warrant needing a deload? Because remember, this deload was implemented. It was a 1 week deload implemented after 4 weeks of training, because it was 4 weeks, then deload, then 4 more weeks, compared to just the 9 weeks straight. Do I think that 4 weeks is long enough on a training program to say like you are going to definitively benefit from a deload? Or if desensitization is a thing, which we don't know if it is a thing, do I think 4 weeks is enough to desensitize you to the anabolic stimulus of training? I don't know. Also, they didn't do any measurements before the deload. They didn't do any measurements at the halfway point. So without any data suggesting that they were desensitized, we can't adequately say that a deload resensitized them. We can only say the deload resensitized them if we have a measure or a marker of desensitization before the deload was implemented. But we just have data at the beginning of the 9 weeks and at the end of the 9 weeks, which makes it hard for us to definitively say what the deload did other than not make a difference. So the last thing that we really kind of talked about when we were getting into this paper and the result and what it means was the ultrasound was run on lower body muscles, and the resistance training sessions that were supervised were the lower body ones. So obviously they were still training upper because they were given that training program, but for the intents and purposes of the results, we need to only focus on the lower body session. So they were training lower body twice a week, right? And the deload was 1 week long, which means there's a 2-session difference between the deload condition and the traditional condition. So with the subjects in the deload group, they trained 2 sessions less over the span of 9 weeks than the traditional group. So the traditional group trained 18 total sessions of lower body in the 9 weeks, and the deload group trained 16 total sessions of lower body in the 9 weeks. But they reported that compliance was around 90%. So if any of the participants in the traditional group missed a session because they reported that their subject's compliance to the study was 90%, so some people were missing sessions, that means that people in the traditional group could have missed 1 session and still been included in the study. So if somebody in the traditional group missed 1 session, then there's only a 1 session difference between the traditional group and the deload group over the span of 9 weeks. Do we expect that 1 lower body session is going to make a detectable difference over the span of 9 weeks? Like, do we really think that 1 resistance training session over the span of 9 weeks is going to make a difference that you'll be able to detect with an ultrasound machine? That to me would be a silly assumption. That to me is silly to think that you would expect a difference from 1 session over the span of 9 weeks. And if there is a difference, for it to be one that you can detect with an ultrasound machine? No, I wish that after 1 session, you could put on the amount of mass that you could detect the difference in an ultrasound machine. But that is not the way hypertrophy works. That is not the way realistic hypertrophy works. So when the study reports that the deload group didn't lose muscle, or that there were no differences between the groups, so you can take a week off and be fine and dandy and not kill your gains, or this and that, or it's saying like deloads work. I don't think that this study is saying deloads work. I just think this study is saying that 1 to 2 sessions over the span of 9 weeks is not going to make the difference between something you can detect on an ultrasound machine. 1 to 2 sessions over the span of 9 weeks is not going to create a detriment that you can detect on an ultrasound machine. Do you guys see what I'm saying? I still think that it's, like I said, a really great conceptual takeaway that you can miss a session or 2 and you are fine. Like, you're not going to lose muscle and you're not going to see changes and you're going to be A-okay if you miss a session or 2. So to me, this entire study that supposedly was like the foundational study for deloads, to me, all this study is saying, hey, you can miss a session or 2 and be just fine, which I still think is a valuable takeaway. I just don't think it was adequately designed to truly test a deload, because to me, a deload needs to be implemented when a deload is warranted, and 4 weeks of resistance training does not warrant a deload. I also think when we're thinking about statistical analyses, to expect a difference between groups when there's only 1 to 2 sessions difference when it comes to training volume or training frequency over the span of 9 weeks, I don't even know if that difference is statistically significant. So if your intervention isn't even different between the groups, why would you expect your results to be? Does that make sense? Like, I just think it was like a golden opportunity to truly create a foundational study on deloads, but the way it was designed, in my opinion, and I guess in our class's opinion, was simply inadequate to truly test if a deload is efficacious. However, like I said, I still think it's a valuable takeaway that they did miss an entire week in the middle of their training program, and they didn't see any detriments to their outcomes when it comes to body composition or muscle thickness. So that is the only deload study we can cover because it's the only deload study that exists. But I wanted to kind of dive into it a little bit because it's the only one out there, and it also got a lot of attention on social media. And I want to make sure we're not putting too much weight on the study itself and mostly just taking that conceptual takeaway to like have that peace of mind. However, I do think we need better design studies on deloads, and this was a great jumping off point, but there's definitely room to continue to determine the effects, if any, of deloads. So that's that. Completely switching topics to a completely different lecture, which is injury prevention. And we're going to be looking at overview, many studies looking at the implementation of specifically eccentric training and injury prevention. So like I said, one of the debates in the field of strength and conditioning is what is the role of a strength and conditioning coach when it comes to these team athletes. Like I said, it's very different for bodybuilders and powerlifters because your time in the weight room is your sport-specific skill. However, for team players, for tennis players, baseball players, gymnists, there we go. I was going to say gymnastics people. For gymnasts, for any sport that really isn't weightlifting, powerlifting, bodybuilding, or anything related to those things, your time in the weight room is meant to improve some kind of metric that translates to an improvement in your sport-specific skill, in your sports performance. And there is a huge drop-off in what you do in the weight room, improvements you see in the weight room, and how those translate to improvements on the field or on the court or on the mat or whatever it may be. There's a huge drop off. Like you can improve your 1 rep max in a squat and you can improve it by like, let's say 100% for ease of numbers. And that might only be translating to like a 5% increase in your sports performance on the field, on the court, on the mat, etc. So it brings into question, what even really is the importance or the point of a strength and conditioning coach in the context of these team athletes? And I'm not saying they don't have a point. They definitely have a point, but it is a point of contention in the field as to like what exactly is their primary role. And in Dr. Buckner's perspective, and potentially overlooked, but irrefutable, probably, I would say, purpose of these coaches is injury prevention. Because the programs that you implement for injury prevention are things you have to do in the weight room, but they strengthen the stability of your sarcomeres, and we'll get to that in a second, in order to increase your motor unit and your muscle fibers' ability to absorb energy and tension, which is going to decrease your likelihood of injury. So the first study we looked at, it's by Kopak et al. It's called The Effects of Exercise for Prevention of Overuse Anterior Knee Pain. It was done in the British Army, and it had 1,502 participants. That is like the massivest sample size ever. And basically, they were randomized to either given an injury prevention program or not. And this was specifically aimed at reducing the occurrence of overuse anterior knee pain. And the program was 3 sets of 10 to 20 exercises. They were like stretching exercises. It was not intense. It was like active dynamic stretching over the course of 14 weeks. And the primary outcome that they looked at was incidence of new cases of anterior knee pain. And again, they were randomized to either doing this little like stretching rehab program for 14 weeks or not doing it. And what they found was, between the control group and the group on this program, there were 36 new cases of anterior knee pain reported in the control group and only 10 new cases reported in the intervention group. When it comes to these British Army men being medically discharged, in the control group, 25 men were medically discharged, while only 3 were medically discharged in the intervention group that did the injury prevention program. But basically, this entire study just concluded that a targeted exercise protocol aimed at reducing anterior knee pain did indeed reduce the occurrence of anterior knee pain, and it improved the secondary outcome of looking at cases of being medically discharged. And this was in a 14-week training program. So this kind of set the stage of like, okay, there is such a purpose for implementing an injury prevention program because it did indeed prevent the injury. That was a statistically significant difference in new anterior knee pain cases between the control group and the group doing this injury prevention program. So there is some importance, some merit to implementing a program for injury prevention. So next, we're going to look at a study by Askling et al., published in 2002. It's called Hamstring Injury Occurrence in Elite Soccer Players. And basically, this was just asking, does preseason strength training with the eccentric hammy emphasis reduce the occurrence of injuries? They had 30 Swedish football players, and they basically were randomized to either doing this injury prevention program or not. They had 16 sessions of this yo-yo flywheel ergometer, which is this pulley system that allows you to overload the eccentric, essentially. So they did 4 sets of 8 reps with 1 minute rest. And again, they did 16 total sessions over the span of the study. And what they found was that there were 13 total hamstring injuries reported at the end of everything. Only 3 of those came from the group in the injury prevention program doing these eccentrically loaded hamstring curls. And 10 of them were in the control group that did not do the eccentrically loaded hamstring curls. So what does this tell us? This tells us that doing eccentric hamstring exercises reduces the occurrence of hamstring injuries. So again, it's starting to set the stage, paint the picture for, okay, eccentric exercise specifically might play a role in preventing injury. So let's continue on this wavelength. There's a study by Peterson et al. Called The Preventative Effect of Eccentric Training on Acute Hamstring Injuries in Men's Soccer. There are 942 total soccer players included in the study. They did their normal soccer training, but the difference between the intervention and the control group that they were randomized to was that the intervention group did 27 sessions of Nordic hamstring curls. And you can do these by yourself if you tuck your feet under something and you slowly try to lower yourself down. It is an eccentric hamstring exercise that you can do body weight, you can add load. They're very hard. So I would start with body weight and honestly start body weight assisted. And they did 27 sessions of this. They started at 2 sets of 5 and they worked their way up to 3 sets of 8 to 12 over the span of 10 weeks. And what they found was that at the end of the 10 weeks, no injuries were reported from the Nordic hamstring curls themselves, but there were 67 acute hamstring injuries reported. And of those 67 total injuries, 52 of them came from the control group that did not do Nordic hamstring curls. And only 15 of them came from the intervention group that did do the Nordic hamstring curls. So this study was saying, okay, Nordics are an eccentric exercise, and now we have 2 studies showing that they do prevent injury, and Nordics are easy and cheap, and you don't need this complicated yo-yo flywheel ergometer that has the pulley system, because those things are thousands of dollars. It's literally a free and cheap way to prevent injury if you just implement some Nordic hamstring curls to prevent, at the very least, hamstring injuries. So why is this happening? So there's a paper by Pohl and Ranson. It was published in 2006, and it's called Eccentric Muscle Actions, Implications for Injury Prevention and Rehabilitation. And it's looking at why eccentric exercise might be resulting in a reduction in injury rates. And so it says eccentric training produces changes in the normal structure of your muscle tendon unit. With eccentric training, this structure, so your sarcomere, your muscle tendon structure, it becomes less compliant, which means essentially less stretchy and more stiff. So it becomes less compliant, more stiff, which increases the force required to produce a change in length. So if this structure is now more stiff and I hit it a little, it's not going to react. If I hit it a lot, now it might react, but the stiffer it gets, the harder you have to hit it in order for it to react, in order for it to change in length. And that is a protective mechanism, because if you think about abrupt changes, you're on the field, you're quickly pivoting, you're doing these quick, abrupt forces onto your muscle tendon unit. In order to produce a change in length, which would then potentially result in injury if it is a large enough, dangerous enough change in length, you now require more force. So small movements aren't going to affect you the way they might have previously, because you have reduced the compliance of that structure. That's what eccentric training is doing at that muscle tendon unit. And so this repeated eccentric training leads to these longer term increases in that muscle stiffness. And this is attributable to adaptations in proteins like myosin and actin, but also titin, which we've talked about in previous episodes, which is that molecular spring that actually stiffens when you're doing an activated eccentric portion of a movement. And titin is a protective protein when it comes to your sarcomere structure. So I personally myself think that a lot of these benefits come from morphological adaptations to Titan, or at least conformational changes to Titan as a result of eccentric training. But essentially, all these adaptations result in this complex adapting to be able to absorb forces produced during sudden and forceful contractions better, which is when you would typically get injured. So all in all, this is why we might be seeing across papers that eccentric training seems to have a pretty profound benefit on injuries and how it can be used as a preventative measure for injuries. The last paper that we looked at is by Schmidt et al. It was a clinical commentary on hamstring injury rehabilitation using lengthened state eccentric training. So this paper, again, it's a review, but it was essentially saying that to get the biggest benefit out of eccentric training for rehabilitation and injury prevention, it should be done seated and it should be done in the lengthened state. And supposedly, according to this paper, the lengthened state minimizes exposure to further muscle strain. So I don't know if I personally prescribe to this specific perspective that the eccentric training has to be done in the lengthened state, but I can conceptualize how it's not something I would dismiss right away by any means because of the way that we've talked that Titan activates in that lengthened state. In the episode on lengthened partials, we talked a lot about the anatomy of what happens when you're actually lengthening that muscle fiber, how Titan is engaging, how it has that protective effect. I can see why you would be getting even more Titan recruitment and Titan adaptation if you are doing the eccentric training in that lengthened state. However, I don't think it needs to be in the lengthened state. Like, I think you're adequately preventing injury if you're training eccentrically. And the thing with these studies is that they were pretty much done on hamstrings and they were pretty much done in soccer players because that's just the population overseas that seems to be really recruitable from what it looks like. And also a lot of the injury prevention research does take place overseas. I don't think us Americans, for some reason, seem to be too preoccupied with injury prevention, but it's a very important thing in the context of team sports. So in the context of any sports, honestly. So the biggest takeaway from the injury prevention lecture was that injury prevention programs do indeed prevent injury. And as a strength and conditioning coach, you need to make sure you're not overlooking this because this is one of the few places where literature has a consensus as to what a benefit you could objectively provide to your athletes is injury prevention through your training program. There is consensus amongst the literature that you creating a program for injury prevention is going to prevent injury. And there's very few things a strength and conditioning coach can do that the literature can overwhelmingly align and support you on, because a lot of things in this field have contradicting evidence supporting them and everyone has to create their own philosophies. And as an athlete, you're going to have to subscribe to a strength and conditioning coach that best aligns with what you also agree with. So I think this field as a whole is half evidence, half philosophy / anecdotal experience. But when it comes to injury prevention, this is one of the few domains where you can go entirely based off the evidence, because the evidence is supporting that you play a very important role in injury prevention with these athletes if you create an adequate program for injury prevention. And what does that adequate program look like? Eccentric training, overloading your eccentric training. And this is because eccentric training causes your overall muscle tendon unit to become less compliant, more stiff, and to better be able to absorb forces caused during sudden or forceful contractions. So that's injury prevention in a nutshell. When it comes to the DELOAD study, it was the one study that did show that you can miss a session or two and not have any detriments to your overall body composition or muscle thickness or hypertrophic outcomes. But in my opinion, it didn't adequately test whether deloads can be effective, because I don't think the study design adequately tested a deload as a true deload should have been. I think there should have been more time training before the deload was implemented. I think some kind of measure of desensitization should have been taken before the deload was implemented and right after the deload and at the end of the study in order to see if deloads do effectively resensitize you. I just think that there are definitely ways in which the deload literature can be improved, but that was the first study of its kind. So, I mean, we can only go up from here. And until then, we can rest assured that missing a week, missing a session, missing 2 sessions is not going to create a detectable difference in our outcomes. So that is all I have for you guys today. Please don't forget to let me know your thoughts on A, the length of the episodes, and then B, the way this was kind of like a 2-part episode. Would you guys have preferred I split this up into 2? I don't know. I'm thinking about it and I'm like, wow, I probably should have just done 2 episodes and then I don't have to film next week. But I didn't do that. Now, did I? So with that being said, I'm going to give you guys back the rest of your day. Thank you as always for listening. If you're interested in becoming a subject, go ahead and email that recruitment email that I have linked in the description, but just know it might take a couple days for us to get back to you. And other than that, keep an eye out on the YouTube and on the Instagram for like a surprise show day in the next however many long, because it's sooner than I like to admit. It's sooner than I think. I'm nervous, but I'm so excited, and it's going to be such a good time. And then we're back to the grind. So thank you guys as always for listening, and I will see you in the next one.